Hey everybody. The focus of this PowerPoint is to go over what was going on in the United States between the Declaration of Independence during the time of the Articles of Confederation through the Constitutional Convention and the beginning of George Washington as president in 1789. And the key concept that we'll first focus on will be about basically the ideals of the Revolutionary War, how they changed and reflected in new beliefs about equality, religion, and so forth that have been developing during the Enlightenment of the 18th century. Going on with our Enlightenment ideas and philosophy, I want to start out with the fact that one of the most important things that was really important to our founding fathers was the idea of talent over hereditary privilege. Keep in mind the system they were coming from was often based on who someone was born to. Birth had a lot. And this new philosophy, this Enlightenment philosophy, was really based more upon a meritocracy. Let those succeed who had the talent. And so we're going to see this kind of as a foundation for a system, and although not a perfect foundation, more so than there was in old Europe. Additionally, even though Americans viewed themselves as a people blessed with liberty, and they were religious by far, separation of church and state became very important. In fact, Jefferson's Virginia Statute on Religious Freedom in 1786 influenced the First Amendment to the Constitution, where the Anglican Church was replaced by this new Episcopal Church in much of the South as well. And we'll see even, in New England, the Congregational churches were a little slower to disestablish, but by about the 1830s or so, we really do see this as a foundation. Separation of church and state didn't necessarily mean that we were free of religious bigotry. We certainly were not, but it was once again a step in that direction. As far as women, they really did not enjoy the increased rights that came about as a result of the revolution. If you remember, Abigail Adams had written a letter to her husband John to remember the ladies during the revolutionary period. Yet women, for the most part, were still second-class citizens, and we're going to see the idea of the ideal of Republican motherhood develop, which is actually reflected in this painting. For the most part, women were to raise their children to be good citizens of the Republic. In many states, women still could not own property if they were married, and if women inherited property and they married afterwards, their husbands took control. So women did not enjoy the same rights as white males did in this new country. Also influencing the government also influencing this new republic will be basically the Republican form of government. If you remember, we had briefly mentioned Common Sense earlier by Thomas Paine, and Common Sense basically was what pushed people towards independence. Nowhere in the universe did a small body such as tiny England rule a continent such as North America. It didn't make sense, and the only just cause was independence. And we're going to see these ideals of republicanism, referring to the form of government without a monarchy, that had been explored during the Enlightenment. We're also going to see the Declaration of Independence, this ideal, and when you look at it as well, the grievances, why the states were upset, and for the most part, they're upset at what they call the tyranny of the British government during this time period. And so we'll see that will also influence this new government that developed in this time period. In addition to all of this, there was also an increased awareness of inequalities in society, especially regarding the issue of slavery. For the most part, all northern states plus Virginia had seen the rise of anti-slavery societies. And if you remember, the Quakers were among the first groups to found such societies. Remember, they had been opposed to slavery since the founding of Pennsylvania in the late 1600s. By about 1800, slavery was eradicated in most of the northern states. And in fact, one of the few achievements of the Articles of Confederation was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Slavery essentially was not allowed above the Ohio River in the Northwest Ordinance. And one of the, during the Constitutional Convention, the slave trade was to be abolished in 1808 according to the Constitution. Now keep in mind, these ideas reflected our founding fathers' ideals. They felt that slavery was an issue that could divide us, and they didn't want to alienate slave societies, especially in the South, but they also thought that slavery was a dying institution, and it would die a natural death soon enough. Of course, with the invention of the cotton gin in the 1790s, that didn't necessarily happen, but it did kind of lead to, but we do see kind of this idea. A lot of the founding fathers had freed their slaves upon their deaths. Some even freed them during the Revolutionary War as well. Okay. Furthermore, with this stronger emphasis on equality, common people openly criticized hereditary organizations. They included any type of elitism in America, anything that smacked of aristocracy that was such as Britain. But reality, the equality really didn't triumph until much later. There were still, there were very few rights for women. Slavery as an issue. Freed African Americans didn't have the same rights as freed white men, and so forth. And we're not going to really see the reduction of landholding requirements for voting until the 1820s and 1830s during that time period. Interestingly, later on, Gordon S. Wood, who wrote The Radicalism of the Revolution, his thesis was that the revolution, though, was the most radical, far-reaching event in American history. That it, despite the fact that equality was slow-moving, that the interests and prosperity of ordinary people, the pursuit of happiness, becomes the goal of government. And it destroyed this aristocracy as had been known for nearly 2,000 years and made possible, this new type of thinking that encouraged anti-slavery. Later on would encourage women's rights movements as well. It gave this view of the revolution, was something that couldn't be seen necessarily right away, because like I said, this was a very unequal society compared to today. But as far as his thesis, that this kind of led to the country that we now know, the ideas of equality that we do preach and we do find as our ideals. We're also going to see, the impact of the Revolution and Declaration of Independence on other countries. Just real quickly, so we'll talk about this later on. In 1789, partially inspired by the American experiment with enlightened issues, we're going to see the French Revolution. And we're also going to see in the early 1800s and 1803, Haiti gains its independence. And by the 1820s, most of Latin America, somewhat based on American ideals, gains their independence as well. The next key concept we're going to discuss is 322, and essentially this is kind of the idea of what was going on in the United States during this time period of Articles of Confederation and ultimately leading up through the Constitutional Convention. As far as these new states' constitutions, most included a Bill of Rights that protected liberty. This was super important to the colonists. Go back and remember, in their minds, they were skeptical of the British monarchy taking away their rights. Most also required an annual elections of some sort. And they all created weak executive and judicial branches. Once again, go back and think that royal brood of Great Britain as described by Thomas Paine. They didn't want that strong. And the admiralty courts, which unfairly tried people in the period prior to the Revolution, were all in the minds of these early citizens. Because of such weak executive and judicial branches, we're going to see strong legislative branches of government. And we're also going to see with that the poorer western districts better represented. Going back to those earlier ideals where some of those western districts did not have that same representation and had been behind, they're going to become a little more politically powerful during this time period, motivated. And a good example would be the Virginia Constitution. This Constitution began in early 1776 in the early events of the Revolution. George Mason, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson were amongst those that contributed to it. And for the most part, besides declaring, of course, the dissolution of the rule of Great Britain over Virginia, and mimicking the Declaration of Independence, accusing George III of being a tyrant, it did create a bicameral General Assembly. It created a governor of Virginia, which would be the executive branch. And the Virginia Declaration of Rights, written by George Mason, focused on guarantees of basic human rights and really became a model for the U.S. Bill of Rights that was later written. And so this was kind of became characteristic of these new state constitutions. They didn't want a strong executive branch of federal government, and they had these really strong legislatures within them. Going on with articles, like I said, there were actually some achievements. We talked earlier about the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. One of the other achievements of the Northwest Ordinance was not just the fact that they didn't allow slavery north of the Ohio River Valley, but as they divided these areas and made plans for how states would come into the nation, one district out of every 36 was reserved to fund schooling. And we're going to see kind of our beginnings of public schooling in this country continue to expand, something in which the United States was far ahead of its European counterparts with. But despite that, there were a lot of difficulties during this time period. For the most part, international trade was somewhat difficult. Spain at one point closed the Mississippi River. They controlled, after the Revolutionary War, France gave Spain Louisiana. They controlled New Orleans, and is going to hurt some of those Western settlers as well. Furthermore, our finances were precarious. We owed money from the war that we weren't paying. States tried to pay some paid their own debts, some did not, and we had no sense of federal government that could actually do something to organize our finances. Internal commerce was hurt during this time period. This it was almost like there were 13 independent states. Some states had tariffs to trade between the two of them, going back and forth. And, we had a very brief economic depression after the Revolutionary War. And the idea of 13 small republics didn't help with internal commerce, didn't help with the economy. Foreign relations were also in trouble during this time period. The federal government didn't have the ability to raise an army. They had to rely upon the states. We couldn't pay our debts to different countries, and we had a hard time, actually protecting ourselves against other countries. If you look at it, for example, at one point, the French wanted their repayment of money loaned during the war, and they restricted our trade with some of the French West Indies, despite the fact they were allies. The British were arming American Indians and so forth. The Spanish were closing ports of New Orleans. And so, we were struggling and we had nothing to do. Also, the Barbary pirates, that we'll talk about later on in North Africa, we had the British Navy to protect our trade over there. Without the British Navy, without their protection, we were vulnerable. We had to basically pay off the pirates in this area. And there was also internal unrest, and probably the best example of this would be Shays' Rebellion. What had happened, Shays' Rebellion occurred, of course, in 1786, 1787 in Massachusetts, and probably this is the most significant rebellion in U.S. history. This was poor backcountry farmers were losing their farms due to mortgage foreclosures and tax delinquencies. Many of them were ex-Revolutionary War veterans, and some, were even sent to debtors' prisons, something that still existed during this time for people who couldn't pay their debts. And Captain Daniel Shays led this rebellion where they demanded cheap paper money, lower taxes, and suspension of foreclosures on mortgages. Shay organized the farmers to march on several cities. He closed courthouses. Courts couldn't seize any more farms. They couldn't throw debtors into prison. And he actually marched into Springfield, where the state Supreme Court was in session and where the arsenal was kept. As they marched on the arsenal, 4 farmers died. New Englanders finally got together, the wealthy New Englanders, and they provided money for a militia. And as they marched on the arsenal, the wealthy New Englanders were able to subdue Shays. Shays was actually arrested, although he was later pardoned. And what we're going to see is that the very significance of this is that the property class really kind of feared what was happening. Many prominent citizens in particular are going to cry out for a stronger central government to make sure this doesn't happen. And also goes back to that idea, keep in mind, in the early period, we tend to think of sectionalism as North versus South, but in this earlier period, it was really more West versus East. Go back to some of the earlier rebellions, Bacon's Rebellion, Western Virginian settlers, the Paxton Boys in Western Pennsylvania, and so forth. And so this was Western Massachusetts. But ultimately, we are going to see, in many respects, Shays' Rebellion kind of lead to the Constitutional Convention. And with that said, except for Rhode Island, all the states sent participants. Leaders were, appointed by state legislatures. I think it was something like 55 delegates convened in Philadelphia. Most were conservative. Many were, many that were seen as more radical, like Sam Adams, were not invited as well. Washington was elected chairman, presided over the convention. Madison's kind of known as the father of the Constitution, along with John Jay and Andrew Hamilton. Adams was there. The sessions were actually held in complete secrecy. Delegates didn't want to advertise their dissension or give fuel to the opposition. I know at this point, we talked about this in class, where Ben Franklin was really quite chatty. He was getting up in age. He could never go unaccompanied. But also, this meeting took place in the summertime without air conditioning, windows closed, so nothing leaked out, in full formal attire. So, it was hot. It was, itself in the rooms, and that kind of did as well. And, we kind of have the idea, the Articles of Confederation was basically scrapped, which went against the wish to revise the government, not replace it. For practical purposes, the U.S. government was overthrown. And we're going to see this replaced with, a stronger federal government going into it. And the idea of what we call federalism, where there's a structure where there's federal government and rights of the federal government, and there's rights of the states. You kind of see that even in today. The speed limit is something that's up to the state. Education is usually up to the state as far as requirements for graduation. There's not a uniform law, driving age, and so forth. And so this federal system is going to be created during this Constitutional Convention. And of course, the issue of representation was the biggest issue that was faced. Two major plans came about, the New Jersey plan and the Virginia plan. The New Jersey plan, or the small state plan, believed that equal representation in a unicameral Congress, regardless of size and population of states, would be fair. A lot of the weaker states, like New Jersey, feared that under the Virginia plan, or the stronger states, that they would join together and dominate the rest. The Virginia plan, or the large state plan, basically written by Madison, that there would be a representation in a bicameral Congress based upon population, proportional representation. Of course, the Great Compromise did create our bicameral legislature, the House of Representatives, supporting the Virginia idea, where representation is based upon population, and the Senate, the upper house, based upon the New Jersey plan, where every state has 2 senators. And this, kind of helped go through with these compromises. It was actually, created in that respect. We're also going to see with the compromise, the electoral system created, a stronger independent branch of government. And we'll see that with our 3 branches of government, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial, this separation of powers. President, for example, was the military commander-in-chief and had wide powers, appointed to him, including judgeships, the veto power. But of course, Congress could override a veto, and the courts could rule something unconstitutional over time. And so we'll see this separation of powers that does develop during this time period. Another compromise is going to be the 3/5 compromise. And once again, slavery was an issue that, many of these people felt was still going to die out soon, and they didn't want slavery to be something that would hold us back from forming a stronger government. And so, what happened, the northern states, many of them had already given up slavery. And they argued that, slaves should not be counted in population count since they were not citizens. And they weren't going to propose abolition. That would have ended the convention right then and there. The South argued their smaller white population would lead to northern domination. And so the compromise, of course, were that slaves would count as 3/5 of a person for representation purposes in the House of Representatives. Equality was essentially sacrificed for union. Once again, this is before the invention of the cotton gin. they believed that slavery would eventually die out, but also do keep in mind that many Northerners also believed that, African Americans were inferior and could only work as menial laborers. It wasn't the spirit of egalitarianism and equality didn't necessarily extend even to free African Americans during this time period. They also agreed, though, at the convention to end the slave trade in 1808, and that would ultimately, most states had already outlawed importation, but this would actually kind of work to end it overall. And finally, of course, we're going to see great debates over ratification that are going to develop during this time period. It would require 9 states, first of all, and if ratified, become the supreme law of the land of those states that ratified it. And Congress submitted the Constitution to the states without recommendations. People were kind of shocked. They didn't realize the articles were being scrapped. Remember the secrecy, and as well. And so we're going to see 2 sides develop: the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists. And so keep in mind, we talk about Federalists during this time period. It's not the Federalist Party that develops later on. In fact, we know James Madison was one of the writers, of the Federalist Papers, and pushed for this idea. Yet he is going to become he personally was a Democratic Republican later on during the party system. So these are more not parties as much as just factions. Federalists wanting to push for the Constitution, Anti-Federalists opposed, and see a lot of ideas behind them. The Federalist Papers, kind of most there are 85 in all, mostly Alexander Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay wrote. There were an influential series of articles for the New York newspapers, and Federalist Paper number 10 by Madison is the most famous as well, refuted the belief that it was impossible to extend a Republican form of government over a large territory. Anti-Federalists were afraid that, they were more for states' rights advocates. They were afraid that for the most part, they would lose their rights as well. They were okay with Articles of Confederation. They were opposed to a strong central government. They were especially opposed to a standing army as well. And they felt that the strong government would threaten the rights of the common people as well. And ultimately, we do see the majority of states passed as well. The 9th state was Virginia, and Virginia only agreed to pass or ratify the Constitution after it was ratified by the United States because they didn't want to be, but they wanted to make sure that a Bill of Rights was added. And there was a promise made that a Bill of Rights would be added, which of course would become the first 10 amendments to the Constitution going into it. North Carolina, Rhode Island were the 2 holdouts. They only ratified it after the Constitution had been in effect for several months. Both states were ruggedly individualist, and ultimately by 1791 or 90, all ratified. But in 1789, Washington becomes the first president of this new country with this new executive branch in 1789, and is going to serve as 2 terms. And that will be the focus. What we will be the focus of our next review PowerPoint.